Well, I show that it is high noon, and I think we should get started. Welcome. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for our third series of the Refocus and Rebuild program. My name is Sandy Ratliff. I'm with Virginia Community Capital, and we're delighted to partner in this program with the Southwest Virginia Small Business Development Centers, the University of Virginia's College at Wise Office of Economic Development, and Aegis IT to present this weekly series, bi-weekly series focused on technology and IT topics. If you've not joined us before, you've missed out. We were just talking before we went live how this has been an excellent series to help businesses learn more about IT issues, little hints that where they can save money, do better with processing credit cards, and so much more. And those are all available online if you want to see those at the Virginia Community Capital's Facebook and YouTube channels. Before I introduce my co-host, I do want to share that this session is being recorded for education and training purposes. Also, to keep the webinar flowing and stay within our 1 hour time, we have muted everyone. However, we do want to hear from you. And if you have a question or many questions for our presenter today, please post those in the Q&A, and we will be sure to address those at the end of his presentation. I would like to turn it over now to Margie Douglas with the Southwest Virginia Small Business Development Center, who will be hosting and moderating our session going forward. So, Margie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sandy. Welcome, everyone. I am Margie Douglas with the Small Business Development Center, and I'm very excited to partner with my colleagues in presenting this training that assists businesses in being sustainable and in growing. Today's Refocus and Rebuild topic is sourcing software, when to buy and when to write your own software. Our presenter is Jonathan Evenden with Aegis IT Solutions. Jonathan is the president and founder of Aegis IT, located in Kingsport, Tennessee. He has been full-time in the IT industry since 2004 and started Aegis IT in 2012. In rare moments when he is not in front of a computer, he loves playing board games, watching Netflix with his wife and son. Jonathan, we appreciate your expert advice. Now take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Margie. Yeah, this is going to be a fun topic. I've really enjoyed this whole series, actually. So today we're going to talk about sourcing software, when to buy and when to write. It's a common question that we get at clients. And so I figured I'd put together some resources in terms of how to help think through what makes sense and what are factors to consider. So first, quick introduction. My background, I've been fixing computers since the mid-90s. My dad brought home a computer, and I was too impatient to have him tell me how to fix it. So I started learning how to fix things my own and just went from there. It is very much a passion, a hobby, and I absolutely love what I do. I started full-time enterprise IT in 2005. I've been involved in getting paid to fix computers long before that, and started Aegis IT in 2012. It was a dream of mine for a long time to be in a position to run my own company. Aegis IT itself, we provide hardware and software support, primarily focusing on businesses and enterprise. We do some residential work, but it's a small percentage of what we do. We also provide managed IT services, so patch management, antivirus support, remote support, and then we also provide disaster recovery and prevention, so backups. And finally, we've done plenty with software development. I personally have been involved in the software development process for some time. I had my first programming class in the 90s, late 90s in high school. Actually took AP Computer Science and had some programming in college as well. I'm not a programmer. I don't particularly enjoy writing code for a living, and I would not do very well if that's all I did professionally. But I'm more of a system administrator that has done programming and can write scripts and code if I absolutely need to. But more importantly, I understand the software development process, and so that is the value that I bring to clients, because we understand how to make it happen, what resources we need, and how to interact with the developers for clients. So let's talk about writing your own code. So when it comes to using software, and picking out software, you basically have 4 different options. You have what I call off-the-shelf software. So this is software that you can just download, install, and run, and you don't really need to do anything to it to make it work. So best example might be Microsoft Office, QuickBooks, Firefox, Chrome. They work fine as soon as you download them and install them and run them. There are options to do extra things to them, but for the most part, when we work with those, we don't need to do anything extra. They just run and they work. The next option is if you take existing software and you modify core components. This is when you start actually writing code. So maybe you have a piece of software and it does this one thing and you want that one thing to function a little bit differently. That is a bit harder. For example, you would not be able to do that with Microsoft Office or QuickBooks or most commercial software. So this feature is going to be limited to the open source realm primarily. And so it is possible to take an open source software and be able to change what it's doing at its core components. After that, you have the option to take existing software and add additional plugins or extensions. I will refer to this as extending existing software throughout the talk. So this is where you have a third-party plugin for Office or a third-party plugin for Chrome or some integration for Firefox or Adobe. And that's actually fairly common. There's thousands of those out there for Microsoft Office, for example. I'll show you a screenshot of how many plugins you can get just for Microsoft Office alone. So these are pretty common, but once again, in all these, you've still got existing software that you're using and basing what you're doing work on. And then finally, you have the from scratch option. And this is a pretty big undertaking. Out of all of these, this is typically the most expensive option. It's also the one that probably takes the longest to do. For example, if I want Microsoft Office, I go to Amazon, I put in my credit card number, I purchase it, I download it, I install it, and I activate it. So you're talking about a 5-minute process. Maybe. I can sometimes do it faster than that. It is very quick to get Microsoft Office up and running. Now, let's say you wanted to write your own Microsoft Office replacement. That's going to take some time. That's not going to be a 5-minute thing just to whip it up and now I've got Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, and the other components to Office. So there are very much good reasons for writing your software from scratch. Time is not one of them. We'll go into more detail on that as well. So each of these options have their own strengths and weaknesses. There are very much compelling business reasons for why you'd want to pick one over the other. And typically what I tell people overall is if you're thinking of writing your own code or developing your own software, we need to do a careful analysis of that situation to make sure that it makes sense and to make sure that there's not some other option or solution that can be had that will be either faster or cheaper. So let's talk about off-the-shelf software. This is probably the one that we spend the most time on. And this is the one that most typically the option that people will pick. So when it comes to off-the-shelf software, the biggest factor is that it's the least amount of time to get started because everything exists. You don't have to write your own code. You don't have to find someone to make this happen. You don't have to make decisions about what programming language, how's it going to host? Are you going to do it on a server? Are you going to do it in the cloud? Are you going to be able to run it locally? Is it going to be a web application? Is it going to be a client application that runs? None of that. You don't have to make any of those decisions. It's already there. It's already made. You don't have to make decisions about project scope and functionality and write up a document to decide what you're going to do. It's just there. That is typically the absolute fastest way to get software working. And I say everything already exists, presumably. There are plenty of times when someone will release a piece of software and it won't work, or it won't be complete, or have core software, core functionality that's missing or broken, or it has bugs. So there's a big asterisk there that for the most part, under normal circumstances, it will already exist and it'll be working. Sometimes that's not the case. Another important part is that as the end user, someone else is paying for updates and maintenance. You are not paying to fix bugs. You are not paying to have someone fix, the section of the program that's broken. Someone else is doing all that. You're not paying for updates and maintenance. You're not paying because the Microsoft discontinued Windows 7 and now you have to make your software work on Windows 10. You're not paying for any of I mean, you are through the cost of the software, but you're not paying a programmer to make sure that everything works properly. So that is a huge advantage for off-the-shelf software. And on average, this will cost you far less than writing your own software. I mean, it's easier to make a compelling case now in the days of cloud, when if you've got an important piece of software and you're now paying monthly large amounts of money and you have no end in sight, then there might be a good reason that cost would be less to write your own software. But now you're factoring in the salary or cost of a programmer, and that's typically pretty expensive. So that's why I can say safely on average, buying off-the-shelf software will cost less than writing it yourself. So what are the downsides to off-the-shelf software? You have no control over the project and features. You have no control over the screens. You have no control over the workflow. You have no control over when you click on this button, this thing does this. And as someone who has to troubleshoot QuickBooks and Microsoft Office, there's plenty of times when I'm sitting there banging my head against the wall because the software is not functioning in a certain way, or it's broken, or something doesn't work that should work, and you have no ability because you're entirely dependent on this other person to fix the problem. For example, today is March 18th, 3 days ago, last week. It was last Friday, Microsoft released an update and it broke printing, like completely broke printing. We have been dealing with it for about a week now, and the update causes blue screens when people try to print under certain circumstances, basically to certain printers. Like just the computer crashes, just 100% straight up crashes. We have no control over that because that is a Microsoft update that was released. And you've got the printer people or the printing company that has their own drivers that are also causing problems. And so you've got these multiple layers of third-party people that are causing blue screens and causing downtime and causing serious problems for end users. That would be a downside. So you have no control over costs as well, because how much does Microsoft Office cost? It's $220 if you go on Amazon. Can you get it for less? Well, not legally. They set the price, and that's all there is to it. You have, if you don't like their software, well, you can try and find an alternative. And yes, there are some alternatives. Corel still exists, but hardly ever used. OpenOffice or LibreOffice is an open source competitor to Microsoft Office, and it works. It's not great in a business scenario. There's compatibility issues between Office and OpenOffice. But if you don't like the price of what you're paying for off-the-shelf software, too bad. You better find another alternative. And you also have vendor lock-in. So there are times when if you are on a platform and you're buying off-the-shelf software, if you don't like how it works, it can be very hard to transition to something else. If you've got business line of software, a line of business software, and you don't like what the vendor's doing, you're going to have to go find something else. And sometimes it can be very hard to transition to another vendor. So that would be a downside to off-the-shelf software. So an important question is, when would you use off-the-shelf software? And the primary factor is when the cost to write something yourself is excessive. So in top of that, and that's where I keep coming back to Microsoft Office and Microsoft QuickBooks, Intuit QuickBooks. And also when the existing software will do most of what you need. So Microsoft Office is extensive in what it can do, and it's expensive to write a replacement. That's why you just don't see a whole lot of other products that are competing with it. There are open source software that will do that, but in the paid software world, it's very expensive to write a true competitor to Microsoft Office that will read documents, that like read the document file format and everything like that to maintain compatibility. So to find a replacement to write it is expensive, and Office will do basically what you need. So that is when using off-the-shelf software makes sense. And when you need it right now, if you can wait a year to be able to make Word documents, then sure, you could potentially write a piece of software yourself. But when it takes all of 5 minutes to purchase Microsoft Office, download it, and install it, that's pretty hard to beat on a time factor. So when you need something right now, and you want to be able to just go get the software, it's extremely hard to beat off-the-shelf software. And I keep coming back to this. You could either spend millions of dollars to write a true competitor, or you could just spend a couple $100s to buy it. QuickBooks, even though they raised the price, it had been, for example, about $200 for Pro, and now it's about $400. Or prior to this past year, Premier was about $300, and now it's about $600. Even then, the cost of a couple $100 is nothing compared to the cost of trying to write that software yourself. And then finally, so basically price and time are the most important factors. That is when you're going to want to use off-the-shelf software. And the bulk of what we do for clients is off-the-shelf software, and it's because of these reasons. The price is less expensive, and the time to be able to use it is pretty important. So let's talk about modifying existing software. Another option is you can take existing software and modify the core components. This is less rare. We don't find ourselves taking this route all that often. And typically, the part of the reason is because you're only going to be able to do that in open source software. What I mean by that, you have commercial software where you buy the software, you install the software, but you don't get access to the source code, meaning you don't have the ability to see how it was written. Open source software is exactly that. The source code is out there. Anyone can go to GitHub or download the source code from other places other repositories that are hosting the software. You can look at the source code, you can make changes to it, and you can do whatever you want to with it. But that's not going to happen in a commercial environment because they're going to keep the source code closed. So you need that in order to be able to make those changes. And then another issue is that your modifications will not be included in the official updates to the software. So if you are, and the example that I'll use later on is when we were trying to decide on ticketing software, there was an open source ticketing software that I was looking at and that I was working on, and it did largely what we wanted to, but there were some things that it didn't do that I wanted it to. So I was going in and making a bunch of changes to that software to make it try and do the things that I was looking for it to do. It was open source, so I had full access to the source code and I could make whatever changes that I wanted to. And so it worked mostly, but any of my changes could potentially be undone by a future update to the software. Meaning my modifications, I would have had to keep track of my modifications, because if the vendor released another update, then my modifications could be potentially undone. So that became overly excessive on the administrative side, and we went with a different solution. And there's the other issue where because your modifications are not included, future updates could just straight up break your changes. I could have this extra feature. On the ticketing system, I could have this thing where if it recognizes that this email address sent it in, okay, we're going to apply this as a VIP status, or we're going to do this extra step to make sure that I see the ticket coming in. Well, if I'm making that modification in a particular section in the software and the vendor does an update, that could be gone entirely, or it could just not work. And so then I have to spend extra time trying to figure out what changes they made in order to make my changes work. And that becomes less fun than you might think. It also could be that future software updates just straight up disable your changes. Maybe this feature, which was written in an older copy of the programming language, just no longer works. We've had that happen too. The actual language itself will progress, and maybe there's features and functions that work in older copies that suddenly, well, not suddenly, because typically you know in advance, but might not work in later copies. So if you've got an older copy of the software and it's running on the older version of the source code or the programming language, and now you update it to the newer version, it's entirely possible, we've had it happen, where those features and functions don't work. Once again, in both cases, you are spending time trying to find out why your changes don't work and what it's going to take to update that. And that can be quite a hassle. And that's the open source ticketing system that we tried. We now use a commercial because the off-the-shelf version was, I needed it now. And so the open source ticketing system did not work because of all the extra overhead that it was going to take for me to maintain what I wanted it to do. Whereas we use a program called Kayako now, and it works great. and it does what I need to. And even though I pay a monthly fee, it's still less hassle than having to keep track of what I had been doing previously. Okay, modifying existing software. When does it make sense to modify existing software? That's where you have open source projects that have been abandoned. This happens all the time. Someone writes this interesting project, and then either they lose interest in the project or they stop, their life changes and they no longer in a position to update it, or you got a group of people who decide to move on to something else. It happens all the time where this project is no longer actively being worked on. And so there are times when you can go in and take what they've worked on and make additional changes to it. And now suddenly you've got something that's a bit more viable for your own use. Sometimes it makes sense when you can make changes, when you can quickly make changes, I should say. If you know how to program, or if you got a programmer on staff and you are in a position where it's not going to take a huge amount of time to make these particular changes, usually if it's something small, that's a bit easier than we need to rewrite this whole section of the program. Then that can sometimes make sense to modify existing software. And finally, you have programming resources but don't want to write entirely new code. This is also a pretty good reason, because writing new code can take a huge amount of time, whereas if you need to modify certain sections of it, that's considerably less time involved. And this is what I was saying about maintenance, and that's why I stopped using that open source ticketing system. The maintenance was a pain, and the potential chance of having changes that I made either broken or disabled was not particularly encouraging. If it's an abandoned project, the chance of that happening is much lower. So that's just things to consider when you're thinking about modifying existing software. So let's talk about extending existing software. So extending existing software is where we're going to make an entirely separate plugin or an extension. This is actually fairly common in certain industries. They may or may not work seamlessly. I've tried to use third-party plugins for Microsoft Office, for example. Mixed success. You'll have plugins that work great. You have plugins that work terribly. The most common one that we see is antivirus software that hooks into Outlook because you want it to be able to, say, scan your email for viruses. Well, that's a third-party plugin that's written by the antivirus vendor, and now they have to tie into Outlook. So it allows for new functionality, but it's not controlled by the original software authors. So let's take that antivirus option for Outlook. You've got Norton or Symantec, and they are allowing new things to happen within Outlook, but Microsoft doesn't control or even necessarily need to know about what they're doing. Now, certainly when you've got two very large organizations, they are coordinating with each other and they're collaborating. And, you might have information passed back and forth about functionality and, hey, we'd really love it if Outlook did this, or how do we get this information out of Outlook? And so if they're big enough companies, that might happen. For smaller companies, that's not going to necessarily happen. If you're a tiny company and you're trying to work on something for Microsoft, they're typically not going to care. So this is great because you now have something that's outside. You're not modifying core software. So if you've got a third-party plugin, there's frequently a better chance that it's going to survive updates to the software. And you also have situations where entire communities are built around creating mods or add-ons or plugins for programs. I've seen that happen. It's more common in, say, the gaming community, and I'll talk about that here in just a second, but that's you'll have entire forums built around modifiers for some game. And my first experience with doing this was I had a client that wanted a custom form in Outlook. It used all the existing fields in Outlook contact, but they wanted it presented in a certain way. And they wanted to store additional information that was not on a regular contact field in Outlook. So we had to go through and write a form that collected all the information that they wanted and then stored it in the correct location. And there were some conditional things such that if someone checked this checkbox, then they need to not be able to check this checkbox, or if they pick this radio button, then they need to be able to put in this field. Things like that, which was pretty great at the time. This was 2004, I want to say, when I did that. So it was a long time ago, at least for me. And I would probably do it very differently now. But at the time, that was a great introduction to, or great experience related to learning how to add on to existing software. All right, so when would it make sense to do this? It works well when the official developer supports this option. What I mean by that is there are companies that actively do not want you writing plugins or add-ons for their software. They will go after people that do that. This is rare, but it's possible. You will have people that will not make an API, for example, if they're cloud hosted, and they don't want you tying into their software because they're concerned about what can happen. There are places like that. You also, in the gaming community, it's extremely common, and there are certain games that are popular just because of how mod friendly they are. Skyrim is one. Minecraft is heavily modified. In fact, let me give you two examples here. Compare Minecraft versus Microsoft Office. So I just did a quick search. You can see there's 71,000 mods that are available for Minecraft on this one website. 71,000 people in their free time have written this many modifiers just for Minecraft on its own. Compare that to Microsoft Office, which is a full-fledged business application. This is on the Microsoft Store, so these are plugins that you can download directly from Microsoft. You've only got 3,400. I mean, that means you've got 20 times more people writing modifiers for a game than you do for a paid business application, which just blows my mind. I was trying to figure out how many people actually use Minecraft. One estimate is that about 500 million people use Minecraft. I think that more people use Microsoft Office, and yet there's more modifiers for Minecraft than there is Microsoft Office. I don't play Minecraft. I've never played Minecraft. I'm not overly familiar with it other than just knowing about it. I was talking to one friend online a couple of days ago, and he was actually writing a modifier for Minecraft. So that's what got me thinking about it. All right, so the big one is coding from scratch. So you decide that you want to write your own software. So let's talk about what goes into this. The biggest value is that you control the project. You get to decide who can use it. You get to decide how they can use it. You get to decide how much it will cost. You get to decide what features you want, and you get to decide how those features will work. So when control is the biggest issue, coding from scratch makes the most sense. And it also means you have the responsibility of keeping it working. That's another huge factor in this, because let's say let's say you've written software that runs in the cloud and you've got a bunch of clients on it. If it goes down, if you have server failure, your internet goes out, or you have a patch that breaks the server, you're responsible for it. You're the one in control. And so now you got a bunch of angry clients that are coming after you for it. But the biggest, like these are huge reasons as to why people write their own software. And this is typically what we're dealing with when we get companies that want us to write software for us. It's not the only reasons. It's also typically the most expensive option, because now you're talking about programmer time. You're talking about time to host it, or resources to run the software on, whether it's a server that you manage or if it's a cloud solution like Amazon or Microsoft Azure. You're still paying somebody for hardware. You're also looking at, if you're going to do it right, you're looking at software development time, or project management time, meaning making sure that the development is going the way that you want it to. You're checking in with your developers, and you hopefully are doing some work up front to flesh out the project scope. You want to guard against scope creep. There's all these things that factor into the actual management of the software development process that's not even programming time. When do you want to code from scratch? And the best time is when you are willing to pay for control. Once again, this is going to take time. So this is not the fast option. This is the control option. Additionally, there are times when you cannot get what you want or what you need out of existing software. And then if you've got this important functionality that you really want, or you want it to work a certain way, or you need this to tie into this other thing, and the only way you can get that to do exactly what you want and the way that you want is when you write it yourself, because no existing software has this combination of all these features. So yeah, then that makes sense. But the primary reason people write their own software is because they want to have the control over the application. And when you are modifying or extending software, this is typically not an option because you don't have control over commercial software. You are not able to make your changes permanent. Typically, there are companies that will take submissions from third party, but that's extremely rare. And also, so there are times when modifying that software or extending software is too risky. For example, you're concerned that your changes are going to get overwritten, or you're concerned that potentially something might get disabled. There are times when it just doesn't make sense, because now you've got money on the table because of programmer time. You've got time on the table because of all the time managing this. That is pretty risky, actually, to be extending or writing or modifying software. And so if you're not willing to take that risk, then writing your own software is a fantastic way to manage that. Once again, that comes down to control. Let's talk about specific examples. So using existing software, I keep mentioning QuickBooks and Microsoft Office because they are huge programs. There is just, I can't even begin to count how much money has gone into the development of both of those products. Microsoft Office, I want to say version 1. I mean, we're talking early 90s. The first one I remember using was Office 95. And I know that there were versions of Office before that. So we're talking 1995. We're talking 25 years of Microsoft developing Office. And I want to say that it's considerably older than that. QuickBooks has been around probably, I think, almost that long. I know I used Quicken back in the late 90s, early 2000s. That was the personal version of QuickBooks. But once again, that software has been around for a very long time. The point is that they have spent an extensive amount of money, millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, to develop these pieces of software. Modifying existing software, that's the open source ticketing system that I was telling you about. We were taking existing software and modifying the core components because I couldn't quite get it to do what I wanted, but I didn't want to have to write a whole ticketing system from scratch. Extending existing software. So we have a client that has an online store in WordPress, and they wanted specific functionality related to what is essentially an affiliate tracking. They want people to be able to click on a link and get credit for the purchases. Now, there is plugins related to that, but it didn't do exactly what we needed. And so as a result, we wrote a plugin that provided the exact functionality in the exact way that that client needed, that was based on WordPress, and it was based on WooCommerce, which is the e-commerce platform for WordPress. And so in that case, the risk wasn't bad because WordPress is a huge platform. The chances of it changing in ways that would break our plugin is low. As well, same thing for WooCommerce. It's a very big platform. It does not change that rapidly. And we're storing data in the database in a way that nothing short of an extensive rewrite, which would basically break all plugins, would affect us. So that was a great option because it meant that we didn't have to write an entire website from scratch. We didn't have to write an entire e-commerce store from scratch. We were able to use existing software, as well as we got the exact functionality that particular client needed with that. And it did not take nearly as long as well because we're using an existing platform, because we're using an existing foundation. It did not take that long to get that written out. So that was really nice. Code from scratch. We've got a client, they want an inventory management system, and it had very specific needs, and they wanted their workflow handled in a very specific way, and there just wasn't a way to do that with existing software. It's a bit niche for that particular client in that particular industry. And so it made sense to write code for them and to write the project from scratch. And, you know, it was a pretty big project, a lot of working parts, and it's a good size software. But because they're the ones who are in control, because they're the ones who decide what features they wanted, they get to make every screen look exactly the way they want. They get to make every report look exactly the way they want. They get all the data exactly the way that they want it. And so we're able to make that work for them in that particular case. It was also far more expensive than the other three options. So let's talk about some other considerations for this. And there's a lot. I'm just trying to hit some of the important things. So once you decide to program, so let's say you know that you're not going to buy off-the-shelf software. Let's say you want to write your own code. How are you going to handle the development? And what I mean by that is, do you have in-house staff that can write code? Do you have a person that you're going to hire for this project? Are you going to go on Craigslist and look for a programmer or Fiverr or any of the work for hire websites out there that are designed to connect programmers with people needing project work? Are you going to hire a company for this project? Would you rather just pay someone like us to write the software for you and make that all happen? So there's advantages and disadvantages to each of these. If you have in-house staff, they're probably programming full time, and now you got to decide how much you're willing to pay for this project, and that's going to be a function of how much time they're going to need to write the software. If you hire a person, then you have, well, I won't say a higher chance of the person disappearing because that's going to depend on the person. But if you've got an established company who's got a better track record, then there's potentially less chance for that person to go AWOL or that company to go AWOL in the middle of development, or, you know, take the money and run, than necessarily a person. However, I know plenty of people who program for themselves and they've done well, you know, programming for themselves. So that's just sort of, who is it? How well do you know them? Who can vouch for them? What kind of references do they have? And then another important question is, do you have experience in managing the software development process? It is a process. It is something that takes time to learn how to do well. You need to know how to protect against scope creep. You need to know how to estimate your time. You need to know how to handle objections by the programmers. The software development is not, we needed to do this and here you go, write the code. It's a pretty intricate process, especially the bigger the software that's involved. You have to make decisions about how are you going to host it, what language are you going to write it in, how are you going to have people use the program, is it going to be a website, is it going to be a desktop client? There's just a lot of decisions that need to be made for the actual management of the software development process. And then do you have the experience in managing programmers? I won't say it's quite as bad as herding cats, but there are times when it's close. Yeah, typically I mean, once again, you can work with a wide range of people. Work with a wide range of programmers in terms of skill, in terms of how well they relate to people. I will say that there's certain stereotypes regarding technical people. I will say that it is frequently earned in many situations. And so there are ways that I interact with programmers that might be different than ways that I interact with end users. And then also, what is your budget? How long do you think it'll take to write this software? And what is the basis of your time estimate? I am thankful that I'm at the point where, at least on smaller projects, something that's in the couple 100-hour range, if you give me a list of features that you want and a couple of core requirements, I can have a pretty decent estimate as to how much programming time that is. You know, it's, some of it is science, some of it is art, some of it depends on what language, some of it depends on which programmer. And so, but I can at least give an explanation as to why I think this amount of time will be required for this project. And so that is where someone with expertise and someone with experience can really help and make that decision. And so other considerations would be, how fast do you need this done? You know, can you wait 6 months? Can you wait a year? Can you wait 2 years? Or do you need it right now? And so these are all factors that go into when we meet with people and we discuss potentially writing software. How are you going to make your decisions based on this? And so just in conclusion, so by way of reminder, what are your most important values? You've got control, you've got price, and you've got time. And this will help guide your decisions in relation to whether you're going to use off-the-shelf software or write code for yourself. And if the single most important thing is control, then just write it yourself or hire someone to write it for you. If price and time is the single most important thing, then off-the-shelf software is going to be your best choice. And if you got a mixture of those, or if you're okay waiting, then maybe you can extend or modify. And each project is different, and we typically recommend a analysis, or we typically recommend a careful analysis just to decide what is going on and how best to handle this whole process. All right. We've got one question. Are there any open source code sites that let you download the code? Yes, there are many. Probably the most well-known one in the programming community is called GitHub. It was purchased by Microsoft a couple years ago. It allows you to post your code for any project and allows you to do revision or version control. So you can go back and look at, version 1.1 did this, version 1.2 did this, version 1.3 did this. I fixed this bug in version 1.3a, and then I found out that I broke it again in version 1.3b. You can go through and look at that whole history on GitHub. It's great for programmers because they can pull down the code very easily using command line tools and push code very easily using command line tools. In fact, one of our projects that we're working on, the developer writes it on his computer. He does a git push to push the code to the GitHub server. And on the server, he does a git pull, downloads the code, and everything's right there. So he doesn't even have to directly copy code from the development computer to the live environment. It's just all handled automatically by Git. There's other places like, there's plenty of other places, but GitHub is by far the most popular one in the programming community.
Thank you, Jonathan. Are there any other questions that have not been typed into the, okay, here's one follow-up. So how does your revision get overwritten when you use open source code?
Yeah, the platform depends on, so your revision, yeah, so when you are, say, pulling down a copy of the open source code, you're basically just replacing what's there. So if someone releases, the next version of the software, you're just downloading whatever changes occur. So, if someone has let's say someone modifies the About Us page on a website. You've got a web server and you modify the About Us page. Well, you've downloaded a new copy of the About Us page and that replaces what's ever there. So you're just basically doing an in-place upgrade with content creep. Yes. It is a huge problem. It will kill a project if you're not careful. Actually, going back, a great example that was a just absolutely public flaming disaster was healthcare.gov. And part of the big issue with the absolute disaster that was healthcare.gov was the constant scope creep and changes that were happening even as they were getting ready to go live. So they would release a set of things that it needed to do. And then 3 weeks later, oh, we need to do this instead. And 2 weeks later, we need to do this instead. And, you can't keep up with that when you're writing a website that's, attempting to affect 300 million people. You can't just keep making changes on the fly the way that was happening. So, yeah, the biggest thing for handling scope creep is a project scope document, a very tightly written project scope document. And if you don't write it tightly, if you leave big loopholes, if you leave big options for changes, you will cause problems for yourself. So when I'm doing a project scope document, I try to make it as tight as possible and handle as many options and edge cases as I can, because I don't want to have, oh, well, this report wasn't, I didn't specifically mention this report, but I got to have it. Okay, that's fine. You're going to, you're going to have to pay for development because this wasn't in the original scope.
Okay, next question. In your original programming, do you sometimes use plugins you find?
Yes. Yes. That is one of the, I don't want to say dirty little secrets, but it's extremely common to be using other people's libraries is what we would call them, where you've got pre-written code that handles, like let's say you need a window drawn on a certain section of the screen. Someone's already got a library for that, I guarantee you. So since you can already find that, why would you want to write that yourself? You can just go on SourceForge, or you can go on you can go on the internet and find, how do I write a widget in C++ that shows this? And someone's got it, I guarantee you. And so that's when you can just drop that in there, modify it for yourself, and take that. But yes, that happens all the time.
So we have an inquisitive bunch today. So the next question, what's the big difference between apps and a program for a website?
Yes, they have a considerable number of differences. You have differences in how you host it. You have differences in the technology that is running it. So they might both have a database, but one, you're going to need to run a web server. The other might be running directly off of a server that's running the application. If you're running a web application, you don't have to install anything on your computer. Whereas something like Microsoft Office or QuickBooks, there's a whole client that has to be installed. As soon as you're installing a client, you now have to maintain that client, which also means any updates have to be installed on every single computer. Like when it comes to QuickBooks, we've got a client that has QuickBooks installed on, say, 20 computers. And anytime there's an update, I have to install that update on 20 computers, or else it's going to break. You got to touch every single one. And so if it was a web application, you update once and now everyone's got it. So there are trade-offs to both. There's just trade-offs to both. There's performance trade-offs, there's infrastructure trade-offs, there's design trade-offs, there's technology. You might write something differently for a desktop application than you would for a web application, like a totally different programming language. So if you've got a programmer that knows one particular language, it wouldn't necessarily make sense to ask them to write a program in something completely different.
So as business advisors, a lot of us in the SBDC world see companies that have good software in place, but they don't know how to use it. What are your recommendations?
Pay us to train you.
So how often, I mean, is every time you have an update, or, what?
It depends on the software. So there's sort of this, I guess, a nasty downward spiral. So for example, Microsoft wants you to buy every single copy of Office that comes out. They release it once every 3 years. They have this careful game where they want to give you enough features and reasons to buy the newest, but if it looks too different, people will complain. So there was actually a huge ordeal when they overhauled the interface between Office 2003 and Office 2007. It went from a more traditional, here's all your menus, to what they call the ribbon interface. It looked very, very different. And that caused no amount of stir, because you've got people who for years have been using Office and they were coming to expect, these features are in this location, and I click here to get this thing over here, and I click here to get this thing over here, and now everything's completely moved around. So that was a pretty crazy change, and that caused a lot of complaints. And you had a lot of historical knowledge that now suddenly doesn't help anymore. So I would say something like QuickBooks has done it really well, in that if you want to import your checkbook, if you want to do your payroll, like if you want to process credit cards, so they have these extra features that if you want to do those extra features, you have to have the latest copy of QuickBooks. And they'll do the past 3 years. So right now, 2021 is out. 2021, 2020, and 2019 are the only copies that will import your bank statements. They have a hard sunset of every 3 years. You can keep using 2018. I actually have a computer right behind me that I just installed 2016 on, because that's what the client has. It'll work perfectly fine. She just can't import her bank statements, process credit cards, or do payroll through it. In her case, she doesn't need it. And so there's no reason for her to upgrade.
Thank you, Jonathan. And one last question, advice for finding a programmer to write something.
Someone else who is happy with the work. It's very much when I'm trying to decide what programmer to work with, it's very much who else has worked with you and how happy they are with you. Because there's frequently times when they have full access to systems. You know, like one of the guys I recently hired for the work, he had full access to the entire back end of that. You know, the guy who wrote the plugin for that web store, he had full access to all the client records. So I better be able to trust him because, you know, he could either delete everything, or I have to trust that his skills are such that he doesn't wipe everything out in the process of writing his plugin, you know, because it's, you know, he's got full access. So there's a very much a high level of trust when it comes to being able to pick somebody like that. And so that's where other positive encounters with other friends. And he actually came by way of referral from someone else.
Okay.
And that worked out pretty well.
So word of mouth works too, right?
Very much so. Very heavily word of mouth. That's actually how I found a lot of people that I work with.
Awesome. Okay. All right. Let's see. I think there's a couple more questions in the Q&A. What are pricing ranges for a company like yours to modify existing software? Say
it
one
really
modification.
Depends. It really depends. It could be a couple hours of programming. It could be hundreds of hours of programming. We just never know until we look at what it does now and how much time will take to make those changes. It's really a function of time, because programmer time is the expensive part.
Do you have like a flat rate per hour, or
yes,
based on the job?
Yeah, typically I'll look at it and I'll say, you know, we'll need 20 hours. I'll come up in my head and I'll say, yeah, we probably need about 20 hours for this, or this probably take us about 40 hours, and then I'll go back to the programmer and say, hey, this is what the client needs, and here's what they have, and here's what I anticipate. How much time do you think it's going to take? And then I'll take what they say and multiply it by a certain factor and compare that to my original estimate, and then go back and give that to the client and base a price off of that.
Okay. What is a common need small businesses ask programmers to do that you see will help the small business?
So the smaller the business, the rarer you are going to need a programmer, in all honesty. Mm-hmm. So I would say the most demand that I've seen is for custom website work. So typically, you know, if you've got a theme that you're working with and you want to add this thing over here, and, you know, you've got a WordPress plugin, but it doesn't quite do what you need it to, and you need to make modifications to this layout over here, then you might need a programmer to make that work. It's extremely rare for a small business. And when I say small business, you know, let's say you've got 20, 25, 30, 40 people. The chances of you needing custom development are low. Most of the people that we're quoting, they're much larger companies. Now, that being said, the web store application was for a company with less than 10 people. And in that case, they're 10 people, but they've actually got a pretty good sized business, and it's a niche industry, and there was nothing else out there that did what they wanted to do. So it actually made sense for them to pay us to write the code, and they're, you know, making tons of money off of the code that we wrote for them, which I'm very excited about. So.
Okay. Well, Jonathan, I don't see any more questions. We really appreciate you for your expert advice. And we thank you for partnering with us on this series. I'd like to let everyone know that we really appreciate you participating. And also we will be having another Refocus and Rebuild session in a couple of weeks. The session will be called Cybersecurity Obligations Insurance. Andrew Darlington with Veritas Risk Management and Insurance Services will be our presenter. And this will be held on Thursday, April the 1st at noon, and no fooling. So, Sandy, I'm going to give it back to you.
Thank you, Margie. Jonathan, hats off if I had one on. You did a great job. And I had a whole page of questions, but I know we're running out of time for you. But I just want to remind people that this session will be available online on Virginia Community Capital's Facebook and YouTube channels. And then I know that our friends at, excuse me, at the Small Business Development Centers and UVA-wise also share those within their network. And if you haven't, go back and watch some of the others from previous sessions. They just seem to be getting better and better going forward. Hope to see everybody on April the 1st. And again, thank you, Jonathan, for your expertise and for leading today's session. I think all of us that are involved in this program know that it's not just presenting it. There's a lot of time that's put into putting the materials together. And I will be sharing the Jonathan's PowerPoint and a link to the YouTube video from today's session a little later this afternoon. So I just ask if the partners have any other questions or.
Well, thanks for letting me present. If you got questions, feel free to email me. I'll be happy to see what I can do to.
Well, I guess the biggest thing, you kept mentioning about, writing software and so forth, but, you just don't pick up the phone. How do you find somebody that does that? Yeah. Number one. Number two, if I'm negotiating that contract, what are some of the top things I should look out for? It's like when the big thing was we were all doing websites. Mm-hmm. I saw so many small businesses get burnt badly. Where the person that developed it owned all of their site info, and they had to start from scratch again, and that was not in their budget. So those are things that I picked up on, because it just reminded me of all of those sad stories that I had heard in the past. And the other thing is, once I modify a piece of software, whatever that may be, I'll just say QuickBooks for the heck of it. Mm-hmm. Well, when they come in and do an update, then do I have to remodify the one that I modified before?
Potentially.
And so that means if I can't do it, I've got to hire that. So when I make that decision, if I'm modifying that, remember that could be a recurring cost for you. And so you better be ready for that. Yep. So those are some of my major questions.
Yeah. And to your point about how do you know? So the people who pay for the development and they didn't get access to their DNS, and they get access to copies of the website, they didn't get admin to the back end. The only thing I could say is that was hopefully an expensive learning solution or learning opportunity. Because I'm an industry insider. I know how and why, and I've seen that happen many times. But if you're new to it and you don't do your due diligence and you don't try to take the time to properly understand or talk to other people who've done it, well, you're now going to be paying for an expensive learning opportunity, shall we say. Yeah. Same thing with software development. Part of it is doing due diligence. Part of it is talking to other people who've been through the process successfully. But at a certain level, there's just going to be trust involved. And that's why we work very, very hard to be trustworthy.
Okay. Thank you. That's it for me. Again, thanks, everybody. Enjoy this spring weather. You may want to have an umbrella on my end of the state of Virginia. But thanks again, Jonathan, and to the team, the partners. I appreciate it. Have a good day, everybody. And be safe.
Thanks. See you guys.